She was very young when they stripped her naked at the border. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. Literally, at a small building on the Rhine River between Austria and France, the young Archduchess Maria Antonia of Habsburg was made to remove every single item of clothing she was wearing, every stitch of it, because nothing Austrian was permitted to cross into France with her. Her ladies-in-waiting, her personal servants, her dog, her clothing, the letters from her mother, all of it left behind. She was handed French garments, given a French name, Marie Antoinette, and delivered naked and alone into a world she had never seen and could barely speak the language of, to marry a stranger she had never met, in a palace that would become the most glamorous prison in history. Everything you think you know about Marie Antoinette is either wrong, incomplete, or so thoroughly buried under 2 centuries of myth that excavating the truth feels like archaeology. The spendthrift queen who bankrupted France. Partly myth. The woman who said, "Let them eat cake," almost certainly never said it. And the quote predates her arrival in France by years. The shallow, frivolous creature of the libelle and the revolutionary pamphlets. A character constructed by her enemies with the specific intention of destroying her. The real Marie Antoinette was something more complicated, more sympathetic, and more tragic than any of those caricatures. And her real life at Versailles was something that no amount of silk or diamonds could make bearable. Let's begin with the mourning, because we have established in an earlier video what mournings at Versailles looked like for the king. But the queen's mourning was its own particular ordeal. Marie Antoinette, as Dauphine and then as queen, was required to submit to the lever, the ritual mourning dressing, in front of an audience of courtiers, just as the king was. But where the king's lever was an exercise in political theater that he had grown up with and largely controlled, for Marie Antoinette it was humiliation wearing the mask of ceremony. The procedure for handing the queen her chemise, her undergarment, was governed by an elaborate hierarchy of precedence. The highest-ranking lady present had the right to perform each step of the dressing. This meant that if a more senior noblewoman arrived, while a less senior one was already holding a garment, the garment had to be passed up the chain, hand to hand, while the queen stood and waited, half-dressed, in the cold. Marie Antoinette was famously reduced to laughter, then to tears, by this ritual on multiple occasions. She once stood, arms out, waiting to receive her chemise, while 3 noblewomen of escalating rank arrived in succession, each displacing the previous one, until the queen was shivering and the room had dissolved into the kind of frozen, formal absurdity that only a system completely detached from human reality could produce. She called it a dreadful nuisance, and that was the polite version of her feelings. She had no privacy. This needs to be understood in its full, literal sense, not as an exaggeration, but as an architectural and social fact. The Queen of France did not have a private life. She ate her meals in public. She received guests in bed, in the formal tradition of the court. She gave birth to all 4 of her children, in a room so crowded with spectators that the press of bodies caused several people to faint from the heat, and the windows had to be forced open to prevent the queen herself from losing consciousness. When her first child, a daughter, was born in December of 1778, the chamber was packed with courtiers of both sexes who had arrived to witness the event as a matter of court privilege. The concept that childbirth was a private or intimate moment was simply not available to her. Her marriage was its own prolonged nightmare. Louis XVI, shy, withdrawn, more interested in locksmithing and hunting than in court life, did not consummate the marriage for 7 years. 7 years! This was not merely a personal disappointment, though it was certainly that. It was a political catastrophe of the first order, because a marriage without children was a marriage that could be annulled, and a queen without an heir was a queen whose position was permanently precarious. The court watched and whispered and calculated. Her mother, the Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, wrote letters, urgent, anxious, increasingly desperate letters, demanding to know why her daughter had not yet produced an heir, and offering advice of a frankness that makes the correspondence uncomfortable, reading even today. The failure of the royal marriage became public property. Satirical pamphlets circulated in Paris depicting the king as impotent and the queen as seeking satisfaction elsewhere, accusations that were, at this stage, almost entirely false, but which stuck with a ferocity that no denial could dislodge. When Marie Antoinette formed a close friendship with the Swedish nobleman Axel von Fersen, a friendship that may or may not have become a love affair, historians debate it still. The Lebels immediately incorporated him into their narratives of her supposed debauchery. By the time the Revolution came, the portrait of Marie Antoinette that most ordinary French people carried in their minds was that of a sexually voracious Austrian who had spent France's treasury on her own pleasure while the people starved. Almost none of it was accurate. All of it was lethal. Because the financial accusations, the ones that had the most traction, the ones that feel most intuitive, require nuance that her enemies were never going to provide. Yes, Marie Antoinette spent extravagantly. Yes, she commissioned extraordinary quantities of dresses from her dressmaker, Rose Bertin, changed her hairstyle so dramatically and so often that her hairstyles became a satirical target across Europe, and gambled at cards with a recklessness that alarmed even her closest friends. But the scale of her personal expenditure, while genuinely large, was a rounding error in the context of French royal finances. France was not bankrupt because of Marie Antoinette's wardrobe. France was bankrupt because of the 7 Years' War, because of the ruinous cost of supporting the American Revolution, because of a tax system so structurally broken that the nobility paid almost nothing, while the peasantry paid almost everything, and because a series of harvests had failed in succession, driving the price of bread to levels that made survival impossible for ordinary families. None of that was Marie Antoinette's fault. None of it. But she was there, she was visible, she was foreign, she was female, and she was wearing diamonds. And in times of crisis, people need a face to place on their suffering. The Lebels gave them hers. Her actual relationship with Versailles, the building, the institution, the way of life, was ambivalent from the beginning and grew more anguished as the years passed. She found the formal rituals of court life suffocating, and she did something that her predecessors had largely avoided. She retreated from them. She created a private world within the world of Versailles, centered on the Petit Trianon, a small palace within the palace grounds that Louis XVI gave her as a personal domain shortly after his accession. There, she built the Hameau de la Reine, the Queen's Hamlet, a fantasy village of thatched cottages, working farm animals, and artificially picturesque landscape where she could pretend, for a few hours at a time, that she was not the most observed woman in Europe. The Hameau has been interpreted as frivolous escapism, as aristocratic condescension, playing at being a peasant while real peasants starved, and there is truth in that reading. But there is also something else in it. The desperate attempt of a woman who had been denied any form of ordinary life to create, within the only space available to her, something that felt human. She kept her own animals. She walked in her gardens without a full retinue of attendants. She spent quiet afternoons in the grass, away from the ceremony and surveillance that defined every other hour of her existence. These are not the actions of a woman who did not understand that ordinary life existed. They are the actions of a woman who yearned for it so intensely that she built a stage-set version of it within her prison walls. The losses she suffered were compounded by the particular cruelty of her position. Grief at Versailles was not a private matter either. Her eldest son and heir, the Dauphin Louis Joseph, died in June of 1789 as the revolution was beginning, wasting away over many months from what was probably tuberculosis of the spine, while Marie Antoinette sat at his bedside in a palace that was simultaneously the theater of political collapse. The king and queen were receiving delegations, managing crises, watching the world they had been born in dissolve, and at the same time, enduring the particular agony of losing a child with no time and no space to grieve. The grief was real, and it was enormous, and history wasn't prepared to pause for it. When the revolution came for Versailles in October of 1789, when the women of Paris marched on the palace in their thousands, armed with pikes and fury, demanding bread and demanding the royal family. The court was not taken by surprise exactly, but it was not prepared either. The night of the 5th of October, a crowd broke into the palace and reached the queen's apartments. Marie Antoinette escaped through a hidden passage moments before the door to her bedroom was forced open, and the men who broke through it stabbed her empty bed with their weapons in frustration. She ran, barefoot and in her nightgown, through corridors she had walked in silk for nearly 20 years, and knocked on the king's door, and waited in the dark for someone to let her in. The family was taken to Paris the following day, escorted by the crowd, with severed heads on pikes carried at the front of the procession. They were installed in the Tuileries Palace, and never returned to Versailles. Marie Antoinette was 33 years old. The years that followed were a slow, grinding descent. The failed flight to Varennes in 1791, the attempt to escape France, thwarted when the king was recognized at a small town near the border, destroyed whatever remained of public sympathy for the royal family, and confirmed in the minds of the revolutionaries that Louis and Marie Antoinette were enemies of France, who could not be trusted with any freedom. The king was executed in January of 1793. In the summer of the same year, Marie Antoinette was forcibly separated from her surviving son, torn from her in a scene she described as the most painful moment of her entire life. A moment she said she could not think of without being destroyed by it. She never saw him again. She was tried in October of 1793 before the Revolutionary Tribunal, in a session that lasted 2 days, and the outcome of which was never in any doubt. The charges against her were a catalogue of fabrications and distortions assembled by the radical journalist Jacques Hébert